Okay, so here is the basic demand curve, which is the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity of it demanded. It's a two-dimensional relationship, so price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis with an origin of 0. The demand curve slopes downwards. There's lots of theories to suggest why it does that, and we'll label it D1. One of the most useful things we can see about the demand curve is the amount of revenue it tells us at any level of price or quantity. Revenue is simply price times quantity, and so it's the area under the demand curve. At price P1, we can see that this is the amount of goods in the market that will be demanded, and the revenue is shown by the area under the curve. If price changes and goes down, for example, the demand curves tell us that the lower the price, the higher the quantity. A new quantity will be called off by the demand curve, but the revenue, well, we'll lose this bit, but gain a new bit of revenue. And only careful measurement will tell us where the revenue is actually maximised under the demand curve. Now we're back to the basic picture of revenue under our demand curve D1. But of course what can happen in the market is what we call a shift in demand. One of the factors other than price that affects demand, such as people's incomes or their tastes and preferences, changes. If it's a positive change, this can shift the demand curve outwards. We'll call it D2. And it really doesn't take too much to realise that, of course, at our price P1, a greater revenue will be called off because a greater quantity will be demanded. We'll call that Q2, even though we haven't changed the price, we've gained more revenue. This not the same as the new equilibrium price, but it just shows the effect of revenue under the demand curve. Okay, so now we're going to do the basic equilibrium diagram, which takes into consideration both demand and supply. So our diagram has the same axes, price and quantity, with the demand curve. We can again call it D1, illustrating the relationship between price and quantity at all the different prices under that particular demand curve. But what we're going to add this time is the supply curve. Those suppliers in the market whose relationship is that the higher the price, the more they want to produce, largely because they get greater profits. Now, we saw in the previous diagram a shift in the demand curve. Let's do that again. And what we see now is we move from this equilibrium price in the market, where we say the market clears, that is to say it's a price that is acceptable to both suppliers and consumers, and the quantity is the same in both instances, so the market has no surplus left in it. But if, for example, tastes change, if this is the market, say, for beef, and there is a credible report coming out of the health research to say that eating beef leads to longer life, well, more people might eat beef, and so their tastes and preferences change, the demand curve shifts outwards, and we can see immediately that nothing has affected the supply curve. The suppliers of beef are still in the same position, they've still got the same sort of costs, it's just now more beef is demanded. And we'll see a switch to a new equilibrium in the market. It won't happen overnight, it will happen fairly iteratively, but ultimately if there is a shift in demand upwards, price and quantity will both increase. Okay, so we start with the basic equilibrium diagram again, and we're in the beef market. And what we're going to have here is an increase in costs for farmers. What this means is that this is something that affects supply immediately. It doesn't affect demand because it's not one of the factors. Consumers don't really care how much cow cake costs. But farmers do because it's one of their costs. And how we illustrate an increase in cost is that suppliers, the farmers now, the supply curve is going to shift, and they're going to say, well, we want higher prices for that same quantity. If we want Q1 to be delivered, we want higher prices. But the consumers say, well, we're not paying those high prices. And we settle back at a new equilibrium. P2 we'll call it, and a new level of revenue. So by costs going up, ultimately farmers are going to be producing less at the same prices, or slightly higher prices producing the same sort of amount that consumers want for that price to achieve an equilibrium. That's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen immediately, but it will ultimately settle back to an equilibrium price when factors affecting these curves change.